Well, okay, where did we leave off? We were talking about the differences between what we do in the community of practice and what a typical PMBOK project management would look like. So the next thing we want to talk about would be scope. So scope comes to our teams, as we all know, in a multitude of ways. So let's start with a little quiz first. Show of hands, everybody that's in the turnaround professional business who's had a client that willingly participated in scope freeze at a timely time, like, T minus 9 or even T minus 6. Now, I can't actually see out into there, but I'm guessing that I got somewhere between, 0 and possibly 1 show of hands there. And good for the person that did have this experience. You're working for a great client and you should try to stay with them. So, that's the first part. And I think that probably the first part of scope probably does have some similarities with, I can imagine a Greenfield PMBOK team that's already been chosen, waiting for their client to finally finalize the construction drawings and approvals. So we may have some overlap at that part, but that's not where scope ends for a turnaround team. So after the painful process of leading the client to scope freeze, then we need to immediately implement a scope control process. And that should be a very robust process. And it should involve sign off on every single order that comes in after this point by the senior steering team members, is what I would recommend. Facility leadership, in other words. It's extremely important to a turnaround management team that your scope control program is very robust. Show of hands, every turnaround manager out there who hasn't seen themselves scapegoated at the end of an execution when things got out of hand because people weren't following the program. Again, hardly any, maybe none. So keep good records and have good programs. So then you have the added work program that kicks in after scope freeze for us. Maybe PMBOK managers also get some amount of added work on their projects, but it's really not the same kind of thing that we're talking about. I've worked turnarounds where the scope we ended up executing was 60% added and found work. And even worse than that, the 40%, which was actual, pre-scope freeze work, was what was left after the client team realized that over half of the work that they'd given us by scope freeze was work they didn't intend to have us execute. That ended up being work we planned and scheduled and were prepared to execute and then pulled off the schedule. So that kind of mistake doesn't go away. That bolts directly onto your direct field labor costs as another indirect. It's work you didn't do, but you don't get to just forget about it, and you don't get to just forget about those costs, right? So again, in your scope control program, then you should have a robust remove work practice. And it also should be signed off, just like the added work. Every single order should be signed off by senior leadership. Trust me, if you get in a situation where the turnaround team, your team, is being scapegoated, or there's some kind of major investigation goes on, you'll want to have this documentation in hand. So the distressing thing for our teams is the work just keeps on coming in. Common thing for turnaround managers is to hear from their planning leads, like, you got to stop, my team can't keep up, you got to make them stop giving us work, and of course we can't. So typically how I set up a team is, once we achieve scope freeze, that work gets planned and scheduled first. The added work just starts accumulating in a file. And as soon as we've completed the initial body of work, hopefully not like the story I just told where completing the initial body of work ends up being 50% wasted time, then you can start doing your added work. But as I was just hinting at, the added work just never stops coming, right? Like, all of you in the community, you've all been there. It just one thing after another. It's a month before turnaround, a turnaround that's been on the books for 3 years, and suddenly you got an order to replace 400 steam traps because it occurred to somebody they should take a look at the condensate return systems. So added work doesn't stop coming. And I do not believe that the average PMBOK project manager deals with that at the same level we do. And this again ties back to what people like Ted Lister have come and talked to you about, that your dynamic schedule at this point now has to start sucking up this work. You haven't even hit execution yet, but you've got to start fitting this added work in. So somewhere along the way, as a turnaround manager, I have to give my team some kind of a breather. So typically at 60 or possibly 45 days out, you're going to call a halt to added work. And it's not going to mean that the client's going to quit adding work, but you have to quit passing the added work to your planning team for the time being. So this introduces yet another aspect of your scope control practice. You need to have a found work practice. And in an ideal world, your found work practice wouldn't come into effect until you actually had people in vessels and were legitimately finding work. The reality, in my experience, is you're going to have to shut down the added work. The client isn't ever going to get to the point where they're not going to add work. So typically, like I said, 45, 60 would be better days out in advance. You're going to close that off, and now you're going to start saving the found work. Now, I talked about found work in one of my earlier episodes, and I know Ted has talked about found work in some of his stuff. Here's where we're going to really put a challenge on our master scheduler now. Already, large amounts of the capacity that would have been in the schedule to deal with found work has already, before we even turn a wheel, has already been sucked up by added work due to sometimes unavoidable circumstances. Things do break. I mean, typically I'm looking for scope freeze 9 months out or something, and in an operating facility, things do break in that time period of time. But I got to tell you, if you get an order for 400 steam traps on a failing condensate return system after scope freeze, that's not just in the course of how things go, right? Like that's a question that in a just world would be going straight back to the leadership and management team of the facility, right? There was plenty of time to prioritize initial scope gathering. Steam trap surveys would seem to be pretty much a no-brainer when you're gathering scope for a total outage. So now we're talking about found work. And as we mentioned before, the reason you have no hope of success doing this kind of work unless you are utilizing DSM scheduling techniques and have a master scheduler that can deliver that promise to you is to suck up the found work. You want to document every piece. Again, I'll remind you, I have worked outages where my final workload, 60% of the work was add-on work. Some of it was found work, some of it was added work. But here's the thing when that happens. In order to be able to meet your timelines, whatever class 3 execution budget you submitted was based on the body of work prior to scope freeze. The expectation of the scope control practice is that every step along the way when your facility manager approves yet another work order, he is approving an estimated generally costed add-on. It is a good idea to, when you meet with your facility manager on a regular basis, to go through added work and found work, whichever the case may be, depending on where you're at on your execution, that you apprise him of the running total, just to make sure everybody's fully understanding. But how many of us in the community of practice have then reached the end of an execution with a client that's added 50% work scope and 0% budget, and insisted that everything get done, and now doesn't understand why costs were so out of control? So that's what I want to say about scope. And the significance of both added work scope and found work scope is that that work will be executed with far less planning and scheduling than is ideal if you're on the path of excellence. And if you could keep your added work down to 10% and your found work down to 10%, then the whole program works very well. But my experience in older facilities, and possibly with less than perfect managerial organization, is that you're not going to keep those numbers that low, and you are still going to be expected to complete the project on time. And unreasonable as it may seem, you could be expected to keep it within the budget, and you could have your own estimates for that budget thrown back at you weeks down the road, with everybody just plain pretending that they don't know about all the added scope. So that's why any kind of a wise turnaround management team has a scope control process that they use religiously, why they do not allow one single work order, not one single dollar's worth of work, into their schedule without it being documented through scope control. Any of us that are not on our first turnaround, that are in this world, know what kinds of things happen after a not so successful turnaround. So my advice for us is have good solid programs and documentations. And what I'm trying to point out here is this is not PMBOK project management. It's not. The timeline isn't flexible. The budget usually isn't flexible. And the work is typically made out of silly putty. Get back to you again in a day or two. Thanks for listening. This is Pete Ryer for the NAVEX team. You have a nice day.